5 years after I died, Lucas returned from abroad. The man who used to be dirt poor and whom I had heartlessly abandoned. Now, after years of hard work, he had finally become the hottest rising star in the business world. He came back here, hoping to see me in my most painful regret. But he didn't know, I had been dead for a long time. As Lucas emerged from the airport, he was greeted by a sea of reporters. Once so poor that he couldn't even afford a necklace and knelt on the ground begging me not to leave, the man was now surrounded by packs of bodyguards, with a beautiful girlfriend by his side. His eyes were sharp and cold, far from his former self. My soul hovered in the crowd, watching him approach from a distance. Whether it was because we hadn't seen each other in 7 years, or because he had truly changed so much, I even, for a moment, couldn't recognize him. It wasn't until my dad's hoarse and exhausted voice rang out loudly next to me, trying his best to be heard over the noise. "Lucas, I'm Victoria's dad." "Victoria, Victoria, do you remember me?" My consciousness was a bit muddled, but my attention was brought back. It was clear it wasn't a figment of my imagination, Lucas had indeed returned. 7 years after our breakup, 5 years after my death, he was back. I followed my dad and came here. I gazed at that familiar yet unfamiliar face. A moment of dizziness swept over me, followed by a piercing pain that engulfed my whole body. Lucas and I, had we really ended up worlds apart? My dad kept yelling, and even some reporters began to pay attention to him. Lucas probably heard it too. But he just casually glanced down, his gaze passing over my dad. Then, with no change in expression, he continued walking towards the exit of the airport. As his bodyguards cleared the way, and he was about to get into the car and leave, my dad's emotions quickly spiraled out of control, pushing and shoving through the crowd, trying to catch up to Lucas. His voice was full of helplessness and pleading, "Lucas, please wait. Please, for the sake of my daughter Victoria, help our family." Lucas finally stopped in his tracks. He turned around, looking at my dad with a cold and mocking glint in his eyes. After a long pause, he finally spoke indifferently, "Sorry, who are you talking about?" He truly seemed to not recognize me, or my dad. For a moment, a sharp pang of pain surged through my heart. Even if after 7 years he had forgotten about me, it might not be so surprising after all. Even if he hadn't forgotten, perhaps at this point, any feelings he had for me had turned to hatred. My dad seemed incredulous, frozen in place. The crowd began to mock and sneer. Thought he really knew him, turns out he was just trying to network. Yeah, look at how shabby he looks, how could Lucas possibly know him? My dad's aged face alternated between pale and green with embarrassment. Once hailed as a boss, he had fallen from grace, and after spending years in prison, he came out only to find that I, his daughter, had already passed away. And my sister, due to the pain, had been in a coma from a car accident for years. Hanging on by a thread, fueled by money. In these years, my dad had exhausted all possible avenues for borrowing money. Dignity and pride meant nothing to him anymore. When Lucas saw my dad fall silent, he opened the car door to get in. But right in front of everyone, my dad knelt down with a loud thud. "Lucas, I beg you, please help us. We are in desperate need. The hospital had given us an ultimatum, pay up, or they wouldn't continue treating my sister." I had never seen my dad kneel before, and in that moment, my heart ached as if being twisted by a knife. But now, with only a soul remaining, I couldn't even lift a finger to help him. Countless cameras zoomed in on my dad, capturing his most humiliating moment. Lucas watched indifferently, until the reporters had their fill, then he said something to the bodyguard beside him. Soon, the bodyguard walked over, helping my dad up and bringing him before Lucas. My dad's face was grey and pale, but his eyes lit up with hope when he looked at Lucas, filled with excitement and surprise. "Lucas, please lend me 100,000. Victoria's sister is gravely ill. I promise to repay you as soon as possible," my dad pleaded. Lucas chuckled lowly, interrupting him bluntly. "I can lend you the money, but let Victoria come and kneel first, then I'll consider it." My dad looked at Lucas in anguish. His face trembled as he said, "But Victoria, my Victoria, she's already..." He couldn't finish his sentence, his eyes welled up with tears. Lucas understood and simply said, "I'm not interested." Well, her knees must be worth a lot. Only someone like Mike should kneel, right? Mike, the man I married 7 years ago. Also, the reason Lucas saw me as having abandoned him. I met Lucas when I was 12 years old that winter. On a day when the first snowfall arrived, I was taken by my childhood friend Mike to the bridge underpass, where I saw Lucas and his mother, looking dirty and disheveled. Lucas' father had committed financial crimes and jumped to his death before being arrested. Mother and son were destitute, drifting without a home when they arrived here. Many kids were gathered around, making fun of them, and Mike eagerly led me into the midst. Pointing at a shivering, fierce-looking Lucas, he said, "See, does he look like a puppy making sounds in his throat?" I got so angry that I kicked Mike in the shin and retorted, "I think you sound more like a barking dog." I chased away the other kids, and instead of giving the breakfast I had bought for Mike to them, I gave it to Lucas and his mother. That's when my connection with Lucas began. And the enmity between Mike and Lucas started from that moment. I often brought them some things and chatted with them. Lucas had no friends after his family's troubles. I was the only one he could talk to. Most of the time, I talked and he listened. He always pretended to be indifferent, saying I was too noisy and annoying. But whenever someone bullied me, he would beat them to the point of breaking bones and send them to the hospital's emergency room. Later, he was asked to write a self-criticism by the hospital, which was to be read out loud in front of the whole school. Refusing to write it, I was afraid he would be expelled, so I wrote 1,000 words for him. On Monday, he stood beneath the national flag. After reading through the self-criticism, he spoke indifferently. "I'll add my own conclusion. Whoever messes with Victoria again, I'll still beat them up." The principal, who had just shown a glimmer of relief, was so irritated that all his facial features were askew. Lucas always keeps his word. When my family fell apart and I had to go work, my boss took advantage of me. Just then, Lucas called, and when he heard me crying, he rushed over to the private room. He grabbed a bottle and smashed it on my boss's head, causing a cut. My boss was rushed to the hospital with a serious head injury and stayed in a coma for 2 months. At that time, both Lucas and I were powerless and were aggressively sued by my boss and his family for what happened. Because of that incident, Lucas ended up spending over 6 months in jail. Before he was taken away by the police, he stayed up all night helping me arrange my food, clothing, and living expenses, worrying that I wouldn't be able to take care of myself. So everyone in our circle knew that I, Victoria, had a watchdog. If anyone dared to bother me, he would bite back. Those events now seem like distant memories. My mind drifted back to the present, looking at Lucas' cold and indifferent face. My father stood in front of Lucas, looking frail and fragile like a dry tree in the wind. He muttered, "No, my Victoria is not like that." He never mentioned the fact that I was already dead. Maybe he couldn't bring himself to say it, or perhaps he refused to accept and acknowledge it over the years. Often at night, he would hold my photo and talk to himself, "My Victoria, why aren't you home yet?" Lucas grew impatient as my father fell silent once again, and he left directly without a word. My father had planned to go back to the hospital, but his phone rang. The hospital called to inform him about the urgent need for a hospital bed. If we couldn't pay the medical expenses by that night, my sister would have to stop her medication and move to a bed in the hallway. My father stood there, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. The autumn wind tousled his hair, revealing a few strands that had started to turn grey. He hesitated and responded faintly, finally gritting his teeth, calling a cab, and following Lucas in his car. 7 years ago, when I broke up with Lucas, my father was still in prison. He didn't know the full extent of how ugly our breakup was or the hardships Lucas went through at that time. He only knew that Lucas and I were deeply in love. And that's why he believed that Lucas might still have some lingering feelings for me. When the car stopped at their destination, and Lucas led his girlfriend inside, without even sparing a glance at my father. My father was left standing outside looking pale and disheveled. He waited until nightfall, only to hear the same message relayed by the maid on Lucas's behalf. If you want the money, let Victoria come and kneel. In the living room, I saw Lucy, whom I hadn't seen in 7 years. She was sitting beside Lucas, frowning and saying something. Lucas's girlfriend must have gone upstairs to rest, as she was nowhere to be seen. Lucy, who had been terminally ill 7 years ago, now looked much healthier. I breathed a sigh of relief for her. Thoughts of the past events and my current situation pierced my heart, but somehow, it all seemed worth it. I heard Lucy sigh, "What's going on between you and this woman? If the news gets out, Victoria will be heartbroken." Little did she know that I was already dead. From the moment she first laid eyes on me, Lucy always addressed me gently as Victoria. She was the kindest and most compassionate person. When I first started dating Lucas, Victoria's family hadn't fallen apart yet. She always reminded Lucas to treat me well. But when Victoria's family faced troubles and declined, she cried and urged Lucas to take care of me and be by my side. When my father was in prison, my sister was seriously ill, and our family was drowning in debts. Lucy stayed up all night comforting me while everyone else avoided us like the plague. She even sold the house she had worked hard to buy and the family heirloom bracelet to help my sister pay for medical expenses. She said to me, in times of hardship, the family should stick together. I grew up with only my father, with no mother. So when I first met Lucy, she felt like a mother to me. She was just as kind to me as Lucas was. Later, when I found out that she had end-stage liver cirrhosis and might not make it, I felt like my world was crumbling. I cried all night until Mike approached me, saying he had found a way to get a suitable liver for Lucy. Unfortunately, the devil never does charity, only trades. Years later, I still vividly remember that night. In the noisy, rain-soaked private room, Lucas, looking completely bedraggled, came to find me. With a pleading look in his eyes, he said, "Victoria, don't break up with me. Please wait for me." I told him that I was a wealthy girl from a good family, and Mike could provide for me. Everyone in the room laughed. Despite the pain in my heart, I managed to fake a saccharine smile and said, "You're begging me? Well, how about you kneel down and then I'll think about it." I thought that was enough to hurt him and end things between us. But Lucas, who had always been proud and never backed down, actually knelt in front of me in front of everyone that night. He looked at me, so distant, making me feel like we were from different worlds. He said, "Victoria, I'll do everything you want." At the time, he was the one who had disregarded Mike, who had been pursuing me resentfully. At this moment, I felt as wretched as a wet and messy dog. He knelt in front of me, and also in front of Mike. Mike had never smiled so happily before, his face was contorted with joy. Lucas has his day now. Look at him, he's got his day as well. What can he use to compete with me for Victoria, huh? Lucas seemed as if he couldn't hear me. In the dim light, he only looked at me, pleading with his eyes, waiting for my answer. Until I touched the necklace on my neck and answered with a smile, "But the efforts of the poor are worthless. This necklace costs over 2 million. How long do you have to work hard for it? 10 years, 20 years, or a lifetime? Lucas, I'm tired of playing the game of the poor." In the private room, thunderous laughter erupted once again. I couldn't recall what happened next, or how Lucas left. I only remembered that for 7 full years, he hadn't returned from abroad. My thoughts snapped back. I heard Lucas's displeased voice, "Mom, why bring up such people?" His tone made it sound like I was something filthy and untouchable. Just mentioning a name would dirty one's tongue. Lucy's face turned ugly. "I know you're still resentful of Victoria. But what happened 7 years ago might have been a misunderstanding." For a moment, I was stunned. Because of this sentence, my nose suddenly felt sour. Lucas visibly avoided any topics related to me. "It's late, Mom, you better rest early. Those are all things of the past." Lucy seemed to be reminded of something, and her emotions suddenly became agitated. I know you don't believe her, but let me tell you, I do. She stood up straight, her eyes firm as she looked at her son. If Victoria really was a vain person, she wouldn't have helped our family before they fell apart, and she wouldn't have taken an interest in you either. As for Mike, he had been chasing after her since he was young. How could she suddenly be interested in his money 7 years ago? My eyes were now red. It turned out that someone had believed in me all along. Suddenly, I didn't know whether to rejoice in fooling Lucas 7 years ago, or to regret that he had never seen through my lies in these 7 years. We used to be so in sync without saying a word. A single glance from me and he could read my mind. Lucas fell silent for a brief moment. He seemed to want to argue about something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. He only instructed the housekeeper to take care of his mother, then went upstairs with a stern face. Lucas's expression, mixed with anger, looked at his back. How many years have passed? Have you really let go of her? My heart skipped a beat, seeing Lucas stop halfway up the stairs. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt nervous. Perhaps deep down, I also wanted to know the answer. Lucas didn't answer, just stood silently facing away from the lower floor. Lucy urgently continued, if you've truly moved on from Victoria, why did you come back 5 years ago? She couldn't finish her sentence. Lucas suddenly turned around, interrupting her words in a cold tone. Mom, enough, stop mentioning her, okay? 5 years ago was when I died. Thinking about those past moments felt like tearing open a wound all over again. The night before I died, I actually contacted Lucas. That was the only phone call we had in the 7 years since we separated. At that time, Lucy had already completed a liver transplant and was nearly recovered. And Mike, he asked for a divorce from me. We had been separated from Lucas for 2 years by then, so why did I still reach out to him? Maybe I clung to a ridiculous, fanciful idea of starting anew. After all, the 2 years of marriage with Mike were not good. I suffered from anorexia, constantly thinking about many things about Lucas. One day, sitting at the dressing table, I suddenly realized that I was starting to look older due to frequent insomnia and loss of appetite. Mike was standing behind me at that moment. He looked at me through the mirror, pity in his eyes, and then uttered a disdainful sound after a while. He said, Victoria, you look old. It's strange. After getting married, I suddenly realized you weren't as beautiful as before. He, the man who had pursued me for over 10 years, the man who claimed to love me, grew tired of me less than 2 years after getting me. At that moment, I suddenly remembered a sentence Lucas had said to me. I hope that when we are old and grey, we can still hold hands and live out the rest of our lives. I found his sentimentality and drama ridiculous back then. But it haunted me night after night, bringing tears to my eyes. Mike started staying out more frequently at night. There were more young and pretty girls around him. Later on, there was one girl who was very good at throwing tantrums, clinging to him tightly. She wanted to marry him and drive me away. Mike then asked for a divorce. That night, he told me, Victoria, I'm letting you go, you can go back to Lucas and start fresh. The night we divorced, I couldn't resist. I really reached out to Lucas. The feeling was strange when I dialed that all too familiar number. It was a mix of strong guilt and shame, immense excitement, and unrestrained longing. Until Lucas coldly told me over the phone that he was getting married soon. He said, Victoria, do you want to come? I have you to thank, after all. What was my answer back then? The memory of the spirit is ultimately limited. I seem to be forgetting many things, including some very important things. I only remember that the next day, while driving, I seemed to have received a call from Mike. I forgot what he said, then I suffered a sudden heart attack. And then, the car accident and death. I detached myself from the memories. Hearing Lucy sigh and soften her voice, if you don't want to go find Victoria again, I'll go to her myself tomorrow. I found out that she got divorced 5 years ago. Lucas tensed his face, remained silent for a long time. Eventually, he replied with a casual go ahead, and went upstairs to the bedroom. He said hello and instructed the maid not to tell Lucy I was standing outside. My dad waited in the cold wind until late at night, but in the end, he wasn't able to seek help from Lucas's family. He returned home in a daze, not even turning on the lights. In the dim moonlight, he went upstairs to the bedroom and opened a safe. Inside, everything that could be exchanged for money had long been sold out, except for one last item, a gold-trimmed jade longevity lock. It was specially made by a master when I was born, and my father was overjoyed. The master said that as long as the longevity lock was there, I would always be safe and free from disasters. After so many years, it could probably still be sold for around 100,000, enough to cover my sister's medical expenses. My father took out the golden lock and held it in his hand, rubbing it back and forth with his fingertips. He sat on the floor, his body trembling. His eyes were bloodshot, as if he was making a final struggle. Over the years, he had always deluded himself. In the dead of night, he would fantasize that I was still alive and would come back sooner or later. It was not until now, when he was at a dead end and had to sell off this last valuable item, that he had to admit that this precious longevity lock was no longer of use. I was dead. His beloved daughter was already dead. What could a so-called longevity lock meant to ensure safety do now? My father's palm trembled, and a sob escaped his throat. After a long time, he finally stopped rubbing the lock and a tear fell on its surface. His voice trembled softly, "Victoria, it will only take a short while. Dad promises to redeem it soon." He rushed back to the hospital overnight to take care of Jessica. The doctor solemnly informed him, she had been in a coma for so many years. Even if he raised money for further treatment, there was no guarantee she would survive. My father stood in the doctor's office, listening in a daze. When the doctor finished, he hoarsely replied, "Just keep treating her." The next morning, he sold the longevity lock and paid for Jessica's medical expenses. I followed him, watching him hurry in and out. I wanted to remind him to slow down. He had heart disease and had aged so much now. Being so anxious and agitated could lead to health problems. I wanted to say all these words of concern, but he couldn't hear a word I said. I stayed with him in the hospital. In the afternoon of the third day, Mike unexpectedly showed up. My father had always believed that my death was somehow related to Mike. He knew me. I was a strong-willed person. No matter how difficult things got, I would never consider ending my life. And 5 years ago, I passed away in a car accident on the second day after divorcing Mike. So, even without evidence, my father had always harbored extreme hatred towards Mike. When Mike arrived, dressed in a suit, he looked much more haggard than before. I thought that after all these years, he had moved on from me, found someone new, and should be living a comfortable life. As soon as he entered the ward, he placed a black card in front of my father. With a smug smile, he said, "I heard things have been tough for you guys, so here's some money for you to spend." My father sat by my sister's bed, stood up at the sight. He stared at Mike with eyes almost tearing apart with hatred. His voice was full of anger, but he tried to keep it down. Get out now." Mike raised an eyebrow, looking helpless. "Just like Victoria, you have no idea how to appreciate kindness." My father's chest heaved with anger, his breathing becoming rapid. "You don't deserve to mention my Victoria. Get out." Mike half raised his hands in a calming gesture, pretending to console my father. As he took a step closer, my father's coughing became more severe. Mike did not approach any further, and there was a mist in his eyes. For a moment, I even felt that I was mistaken. Mike chuckled slightly dazedly, saying, "Evidence. Evidence that I have killed Victoria. Don't joke around. I loved Victoria the most." As he said this, my father coughed so hard that he almost couldn't catch his breath. I became frantic, screaming for help, but no one could hear me. I watched as my father, after a violent bout of coughing, spat out blood. Panicking, I screamed for help, but no one could hear me. After my father finished coughing up blood, his face quickly turned pale. Like a withering leaf in the wind, his body slowly began to crouch down. Suddenly, someone burst into the room from outside. The person had a dark complexion and grabbed Mike's shoulder, pulling him away. Mike was caught off guard, stumbled, and awkwardly fell to the ground. As he got up and saw the intruder clearly, he didn't seem angry. Instead, his eyes reddened as he laughed. The fool is finally back in the country. It was Lucas who had entered, along with his mother. Lucas had been searching for days and finally found his way here. He claimed to have caught a cold and come to the hospital by chance, only to run into his mother. In the corridor outside, I overheard Lucas saying, even with a high fever of 40 degrees, they have to convene a meeting of executives first. And they come to the hospital for a little cold. Wanting to bask in my light, just say you're here to find Victoria. Lucas remained silent throughout the confrontation. When Mike looked at him, it was as if he was witnessing a colossal joke. 7 years later, you are finally back in the country. Ignoring Mike, Lucas helped my father up, while his mother called for medical staff. My father was quickly rushed to the emergency room, and once it was confirmed he was stable, I breathed a sigh of relief. Lucas followed the medical staff, who pushed my father into the ward. Sitting on a chair outside the ward, Lucas stared at the white wall in front of him, his gaze unfocused. It was then that I noticed how much weight he had lost. Even though he exuded elegance in his suit, he couldn't conceal the deep fatigue in his eyes. Ignoring his disgust, Mike sat down beside him somewhat provocatively. So, back to the country to pick up Victoria. He was referring to my ashes. But Lucas didn't understand and quickly sneered, pick her up. Maybe I'll consider it when she kneels in front of me. This was something I had said to him before. Perhaps it had truly wounded him back then, causing him to now repeatedly want me back. Mike paused, looking at Lucas with a mix of surprise. After staring for a while, his expression turned strangely intense, as if he had just discovered something groundbreaking. You don't really know yet, do you? Ignoring Mike, Lucas continued staring at the wall, seeming lost in thought. It wasn't until Mike's shocked voice rang out, you really don't know, do you? Victoria died 5 years ago. Silence enveloped the surroundings. My heart seemed to rise to my throat for a moment. Suddenly, I wondered if this news of my death, 5 years late, had finally reached Lucas's ears. How would he feel now? It had been 7 years since we last met, and perhaps, whether it was love or hate, it had all faded. Maybe there wouldn't be much feeling left at all. Indeed, Lucas didn't react much. When Mike's voice fell, he just fell silent for a moment, furrowing his brow slightly. There was no sadness on his face, but rather he quickly chuckled. Is that so? When did she die? In that moment, my heart felt like it had been pierced by a needle. Then it hit me, I was dead. Dead people only have souls, not bodies. But why did the pain feel so real? Mike probably didn't expect Lucas to react this way. The smile on his face vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief as he stared at the man next to him, now cold and emotionless, as if he was staring at a monster. After a while, he finally exclaimed in anger, Lucas, Victoria is dead, and you're not even sad. Lucas's expression remained unchanged. It was Mike, usually devoid of emotion, who seemed like an affectionate clown at that moment. Mike seemed unable to accept the reaction before him. His face contorted in what seemed like agony. You're not sad. Lucas, how can you not be sad? How can you not be sad? Lucas, Victoria is dead. She died in a car accident 5 years ago. I didn't expect that Mike would react so strongly to my death at this moment. 5 years ago, when we divorced, there was no love left between us. Even at my funeral, as my ex-husband, he didn't shed a tear. But now, I saw him with red-rimmed eyes. And Lucas remained like an outsider, indifferent to a matter that didn't concern him. He coldly watched Mike teetering on the edge of collapse, finding it somewhat amusing. Sad? What about her is worth my sadness? This remark was like a spark that made Mike suddenly lose control. His eyes filled with rage and resentment, mixed with other incomprehensible emotions. He stood up abruptly, approaching Lucas and grabbing the man's collar fiercely. With all his might, he landed a vicious punch on Lucas's face, almost hitting his nose. Upon impact, blood appeared on Lucas's face. Lucas fell to the ground, and for the first time, his face, always calm, showed a hint of a different emotion. Not anger, but confusion. Deep confusion. He didn't even raise his hand to wipe away the blood. Just looking at Mike strangely, his eyes filled with bewilderment. He seemed to not understand why Mike had struck him. With veins of blood in his eyes, Mike stared at the man who had fallen to the ground. Victoria is dead. And all because of you. It's all your fault. His eyes brimmed with anger and resentment, before slowly being suppressed, turning into pain and confusion. He crouched down, hugging himself, shuddering and shaking. Not you, it's me. I killed Victoria, it's me, I am the murderer. He seemed to be going crazy, or perhaps trapped in a nightmare, repeating these words over and over. Lucas finally frowned, stood up, and looked at the man crouching and muttering, with a voice full of disgust, but also a hint of restrained tremble. Are you insane? Is this joke funny? For a long time, Mike didn't speak again. He slowly lowered his hands from covering his face, palms trembling as he covered his face. I saw his hands, shoulders, and then his whole body trembling, consumed by immense pain. Frankly, as I watched him, I felt a mixture of amusement and disgust. He was the root of all my nightmares. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have ended up like this today. The person in this world least deserving of mourning my death was him. After what seemed like an eternity, Mike finally released his hands from covering his face. He stood up slowly, looking strange and desolate. Without looking at Lucas, he walked fragmented and lost, like a wandering soul, toward the end of the hallway. Lucas stared at his retreating figure, his expression turning increasingly grim. He could clearly hear Mike's voice growing distant, sounding like a mumble. Yes, it's a joke. This joke isn't funny. Victoria didn't die. The sound grew fainter and eventually disappeared at the end of the corridor along with Mike's figure. Lucas's face had turned dark, resembling a thundercloud. Just like Lucy, Lucas had always been a well-mannered person who rarely lost control of himself. But today, for the second time, he almost gritted his teeth and cursed to himself, crazy. No one responded to his words. He started to feel irritated, took out a pack of cigarettes and a lighter from his pocket. Muttering curses under his breath, divorce and then cursing people to death, crazy. It was late at night. The only response to his presence was the prolonged silence in the corridor. Lucas took a cigarette out of the pack and tried to light it with the lighter. Despite its simplicity, he struggled to ignite the cigarette for quite some time. Just then, a nurse happened to pass by, on her way to the ward to change a patient's medication. Seeing Lucas trying to light the cigarette, the young girl reminded him, "Sir, please smoke over there." Ignoring her, Lucas kept trying to light the cigarette. The flame flickered between his fingers, unable to catch fire. It was only when the nurse's voice cut through the silence that he seemed to snap out of a daze. His hand trembled, causing the lighter, the pack of cigarettes, and the cigarette between his lips to fall to the ground. He looked up abruptly at the nurse. Since his return to the country, he had always had cold and distant eyes. But in a deep night like this, there was no longer any disguise in his eyes. They were filled with profound confusion and helplessness. The nurse was taken aback by his reaction and kindly picked up the fallen items, handing them back to him, asking with concern, "Sir, are you okay?" Lucas stared at the nurse's face for a long time, seeming to be lost in a daze once again. It was not until the young girl's ears turned red that he finally came back to his senses. Taking the items back, his voice slightly trembling, he replied, "I'm fine, thank you." The nurse quickly left, and Lucas suddenly appeared agitated, taking out his phone hastily. I was a bit surprised to see that without hesitation, he directly accessed my social media platform. I thought he had deleted me a long time ago. During the 2 years when I split up with him and got married to Mike, I only posted sporadic updates, mostly related to work. However, in the 5 years since my death, my account had been consistently active with frequent updates about my happy and fulfilling life. Every post featured the same person, Mike. The most recent post was from last night, a photo taken at the restaurant of a small apartment I once owned. The table was set with a romantic candlelit dinner. In the flickering candlelight, two hands were interlocked. One hand donned a Cartier men's watch, clearly Mike's. The other hand was slender and fair-skinned, wearing the wedding ring I had with Mike. It was unmistakably mine. I had known all along that these posts were made by Mike. After my death, he had taken my phone. In some perverse way, he had been using my identity and account to post updates portraying Victoria deeply in love with Mike, which I found utterly disgusting, but couldn't stop. My sister had been seriously ill for years, and my father, after being released from prison, was busy raising money for medical expenses. Moreover, Mike had blocked my family from viewing these posts, so they never found out. A few of Mike's friends had tried to dissuade him through numerous phone calls over the years, expressing their discomfort. Can you please stop? It's really creepy. But unfortunately, it didn't make any difference. I watched as Lucas scrolled through my posts, one by one, until he reached the 7-year mark. He seemed not to have noticed anything amiss yet. After going through them twice, his finger suddenly stopped at one particular post. It was the first fake post Mike had created using my account 5 years ago. In the photo, Mike held my hand, interlocking our fingers over a necklace on my collarbone. Even though I had seen this fake post before, I couldn't help but shiver uncontrollably. It wasn't just the words written, but also because the meat in the photo was already dead. It was the first day of my death. Before I was pushed into the crematorium, Mike crouched next to my body. He held my hand and took that photo. It marked the starting point of a stark transition in my social media posts. Lucas stared at the post for a long time. His expression grew increasingly strange. Finally, he seemed to realize that something was off. He quickly enlarged the photo and scrutinized it. Fakes can't hide all their flaws, can they? My skin color in the photo appeared unnaturally pale. There were some faint bloody smudges on the side of my face and neck that hadn't been cleaned properly, and traces of the wound on my face covered by makeup were faintly visible. It was apparent that Lucas was seeing the photo and inspecting it thoroughly for the first time. He zoomed in and repositioned the image. Soon, his fingers began to tremble, and his breathing became heavy. It was as if he had torn open the first seam leading to the truth, and the opening was rapidly widening. Trembling, Lucas hastily scrolled through the other posts, unable to contain his impatience. With so many inconsistencies, he could no longer overlook them. The tone of the posts made in the last 5 years, by my account, was noticeably different from my usual way of speaking. Surprisingly, not a single post in nearly 100 contained my face. During the 2 years of my marriage to Mike, there had not been a single post related to him. And right from the second day of our divorce, I began relentlessly sharing posts of our love life. It was as if I had become a completely different person 5 years ago. Lucas was not a fool. At this moment, a truth was staring him in the face. I didn't post those updates for the past 5 years. And yet, the false updates have been out for 5 years, and I never tried to stop them. The reason might just be. Lucas suddenly stood up and almost stormed into my dad's hospital room. I saw a strange crimson glint in his eyes. My dad had just come out of the emergency room and was conscious. He had just gotten off the hospital bed and wanted to go upstairs to see my sister. Lucy was trying to stop him, saying, "You should lie down and rest. I have someone watching over Jessica." The two of them were at a standstill when suddenly Lucas burst in. They were both startled by his dark and intimidating appearance. Lucas took out his wallet, emptied all the cash inside, and then grabbed a bank card. Finally, he stuffed the cash, along with the card, into my dad's hand. Despite trying to control himself, his emotions were clearly on the brink of spiraling out of control. It was like a heavily snow-loaded mountain that was about to collapse at any moment. He stared at my dad and almost pleaded, "Take however much money you need. Just tell me, where is Victoria?" My dad had been in a rush to leave, but upon hearing those words, he froze as if paralyzed. Another expression of intense agony appeared on his face. Years ago, when Lucas had just returned from abroad, he had seen a similar expression on my dad at the airport. Back then, Lucas had seemed indifferent, even impatient. But now, facing my dad's expression, his hands slowly clenched. It was as if he unconsciously tightened his grip, then tried to relax his palms. But in an instant, his hands clenched into fists uncontrollably, trembling and quivering, veins popping out on the back of his hands. His tone softened, as if he was trying to find a gentle and effective way to talk to my dad, asking about my whereabouts. I don't want to cause her trouble. I really don't. I just have just a few things, to ask her. My dad's aged face trembled, his lips parted, but he seemed lost in thought, unable to say a word. Finally, with a choking voice, he managed to say, "Victoria, she." Lucas stared at my dad as if trying to bore a hole through him, searching for any clue about my location. He kept urging my dad to stay calm and speak slowly, but the one who couldn't seem to calm down was him. "Where is Victoria? Why won't you say? Is she avoiding me, too scared to see me? I've forgotten all those things. I'm getting married now." With an eager tone, he pulled out a wedding invitation photo from his phone, showing a picture of himself and his girlfriend, Cindy. It reminded me of the night 5 years ago, when he had said the same thing to me. Whether he was lying or just busy with work all these years, and now the wedding had been postponed until today. He was eager to show the photo to my dad. But before he could hand it over, my dad's trembling voice spoke up, "Victoria has passed away." Lucas froze in the middle of reaching out with his phone. My dad seemed to have lost his soul, murmuring, "5 years ago, the day after Victoria divorced Mike, she got into a car accident and left us." Lucas's body seemed to be completely frozen in place. Lucy was struck as if by lightning, her face a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Unable to bear it, she turned pale and collapsed to the ground. The maid hurried in to call the doctor, and helped her out of the room. I knew that Lucy had been wanting to return to her homeland for a long time. But after her liver transplant, she had severe rejection reactions. She had been living in the hospital almost all these years, unable to travel back due to her health. With Lucas's interference, she had tried many times to return, but only managed it now. After Lucy left, only my dad and Lucas were left in the room. Staring at each other, both looked like puppets without souls. My dad stared blankly at Lucas and finally spoke softly, "Lucas, I heard that you hate my daughter Victoria, but 7 years ago, the liver that matched your mother was sought by Victoria, with Mike's help, risking her own life. Why do you still hate my daughter?" These were things my dad had only recently found out. A few days ago at the airport, he noticed Lucas's extremely cold attitude. He couldn't help but wonder if he had done something wrong when I broke up with Lucas 7 years ago. After checking a bit, all he found was that I had begged Mike back then to help Lucy find a matching liver. As for other matters, like my marriage to Mike and separating from Lucas, he probably figured it out quickly. That night, I saw him holding my urn, saying, "You were always Daddy's little treasure. You were not a bad child. Daddy knows best. Victoria, you were wronged. I wasn't that noble to sacrifice my own life. I just knew Mike's possessiveness and playboy nature. When I agreed to marry him in exchange for Lucy's successful liver transplant, I was thinking ahead. When Mike got tired of me soon, I could leave him and explain everything to Lucas. Maybe I wouldn't even need to explain, Lucas would understand. He knew me so well, he could always read my mind. But things never go as planned. Mike held onto me unwillingly for nearly 2 years before letting me go. And that accident happened so suddenly, I didn't have a chance to talk to Lucas properly. Lucas had no idea that the liver his mother received was somehow connected to me. Upon hearing my dad's words, his eyes shook violently. In an instant, he seemed to have received a sharp and unimaginable blow. At first, he was shocked and disbelieving, then slowly memories from 7 years ago began to resurface, connecting the dots bit by bit. And in that moment, everything suddenly made sense, providing the most rational truth and explanation. Countless things he had failed to understand in those 7 years now began to unveil their true nature before his eyes. For 7 years, such a long time. After 7 years, the so-called truth, the so-called explanations, had already lost their meanings. The shock in Lucas's eyes dissipated, leaving only a deep sense of despair and confusion. My dad, looking at the man in front of him with a pained and twisted expression, remained indifferent. Lucas, all these 7 years, did you think that my daughter could be that kind of person? Lucas looked blankly at my dad. The face that once seemed perfect in my eyes, now drained of color. He seemed to be speechless, unable to utter a word. Seeming as if someone had suddenly grabbed his throat. His breathing became labored, on the brink of suffocation. His complexion changing from pale to a bluish-purple hue, as if lacking oxygen. It was as if he had suddenly stopped breathing, his expression one of pain and distortion. My dad shook his head slightly, tugging at the corner of his mouth with a touch of sadness. My daughter, if she really were the kind of person who loves money and power. Back then, in our prime, admired by wealthy and powerful suitors, letting her choose freely. And then there was you, Lucas, from a humble background. What was it all about? Lucas stammered with thin lips, hesitated for a long time, standing frozen, his eye sockets now red. He trembled all over, but still tried to live in his own world. I don't believe this, Victoria couldn't possibly be dead. She must be intentionally hiding from me, but where is she? My dad, with a look of complete disappointment in his eyes. After 7 years of hard work, Lucas has finally made a name for himself. Surely he hurried back to the country, eager to find my daughter and perhaps show off a bit, right? Without a doubt, this hit a nerve with Lucas. If there was someone he wanted to impress the most with his current achievements, it was naturally me. Lucas, the renowned head of a technology company, now even more impressive than Mike. How perfect it would be to vent his frustrations in front of his ex-girlfriend, who had once admired him. Perhaps this was the biggest motivation for him to climb up the ladder with all his might over the past 7 years. Lucas continued to shake his head, his expression gradually becoming strange and erratic. No, Victoria can't be dead. I'll go find her, he said as he stumbled and tried to walk out of the ward. My dad looked at him coldly and spoke softly again. When my daughter came to visit, she brought you to show me. She told me excitedly how much you and she were in sync. In the end, it all comes down to one sentence. My dad's voice faltered slightly, and with a sigh, he added the last sentence. It's Victoria, it's our family, we misjudged you, overestimated you. A pang of bitterness surged in my eyes as I closed them. There were some things that I myself had been unwilling to admit or face in these 7 years. The man I had once loved wholeheartedly, I now could believe that I could be the kind of woman who was greedy and abandoned love for vanity. In this world, there is no such thing as flawless acting. I played a role, but he believed in it. For 7 years, he never doubted. When I took my last breath covered in blood after the accident, my beloved, the man I had cherished, was busy plotting how to gain more money and power, causing me pain and regret. It turned out he didn't understand me after all. After my dad said those words, it seemed like he had exhausted all his emotions. With an empty look on his face, he left the ward before Lucas. Lucas stood still for a long time, his face drained of color. It wasn't until a long time later that he seemed to finally awaken from his dream. Turning back, he dashed out in a frenzy, wanting to catch up to my dad. Where is Victoria? Please tell me where she is. But my dad was nowhere to be seen in the corridor. For 7 years, Lucas had been climbing the corporate ladder with ruthless determination, seemingly indestructible. But at that moment, it was as if he had been stripped of a bone. As he walked down the corridor, his body swayed violently. Even though he immediately reached out to support himself on the wall, his body felt as weak as mud, and he slumped to the ground. Countless eyes turned toward him. As they looked at this man in expensive attire, once dignified and noble. Now sitting on the ground, his dignity lost, looking disheveled and miserable. To many, he seemed like a huge joke. But he seemed oblivious, staggering to his feet once more. Stumbling, he made his way to the end of the corridor, muttering to himself in a voice devoid of any composure, "Just see me, at least see me. We promised that we should sit down and talk about anything." Did I say something like that? My memory seems to be failing. I don't remember saying those things. But since Lucas said it, we probably did say it 7 years ago. Look at this man. Saying he loves me, yet not truly understanding me. Saying he doesn't love me, but remembering those words said 7 years ago. It's quite contradictory. Perhaps after death, the soul's emotions also become dull and numb. At this moment, looking at him in this state, I felt as if I had very few emotions left. Lucas went to find my dad again, but for several days in a row, my dad refused to see him. Lucy was devastated, fell ill and slipped into a coma for several days, and had to be rushed to the emergency room. As soon as her condition improved slightly, she went directly to my house. Being almost 60 years old, she knelt outside my house, alongside Lucas. Begging to see my dad one more time, begging to see my ashes. But what could a handful of ashes show? My dad probably felt that he had said everything that day to Lucas. But unfortunately, the end result was just Lucas not believing it. He didn't even manage to offer an apology, or a word of gratitude on behalf of his daughter. So this time, no matter what he said, my dad was unwilling to see them again. Only in the wee hours of the following night, he saw Lucas still kneeling outside my house in the pouring rain. He must have a soft heart, as he sent a message, "Don't come here. Victoria is no longer here, and whatever you have to say, she can't hear it. I don't have anything I want to hear either." Whether it's an apology, regret, guilt, or gratitude. 7 long years have passed, and now bringing it up will not make any difference emotionally or factually. In the pouring rain, the figure slowly got up and walked away, disappearing into the rain curtain like a wandering soul. My father looked out the window, watching until the figure vanished, then squatted down slowly. Holding my ashes, he gently caressed it as if he did to me when I was a child, with his warm and big palm. He whispered to the ashes, "Victoria didn't say forgive. How could I forgive you on her behalf?" He has aged. 7 years have left many traces of time on his face. That night, Lucas went to find Mike. Perhaps after days of heartache, he suddenly remembered that Mike held many truths that only he knew. When he arrived at the nightclub VIP room, he heard Mike calling out to the girl in his arms. The room was filled with alcohol fumes, and Lucas entered, witnessing several girls who bore at least a 6 or 7-point resemblance to me, with one looking almost identical to me, indicating multiple plastic surgeries. Mike, inebriated, greeted Lucas with smirk and explained that the girls were lookalikes hired to pose as Victoria on social media. A brawl broke out as Lucas, enraged, punched Mike to the ground. Mike, bloody but still laughing, taunted Lucas for falling for the elaborate deception. Mike continued to taunt Lucas, revealing his manipulations to ensure Lucy's liver transplant failed, leading to my death in a car accident years later. The forgotten truth emerged, reigniting the intense pain and regret of that fateful day. Lucas, overwhelmed by emotions, unleashed his fury on Mike, the room echoing with the sound of shattering glass and Lucas's muttered curses. As Mike lay unconscious on the floor, Lucas, emotionally drained, slammed his fist onto the table, blood dripping from his wounded hand. The room fell silent, except for the sound of blood dripping onto the floor. The fist didn't loosen, instead, pressed harder onto the pile of broken glass. On the coffee table, a spreading pool of bright red was becoming more visible. He sat there silently, letting the glass pieces keep piercing his back of the hand, allowing the blood on the coffee table to increase. I turned my gaze away. At this point, maybe it wasn't about feeling sorry, just finding the blood color somewhat unsettling. Lucas remained seated in a desolate silence. It was well into the night when Mike woke up. Sitting up, both of them exhausted, they locked eyes. I watched, finding it almost amusing. Truly, there was no feeling left. 7 years, one heart, all the pain was long gone. Mike looked at him, and after a long while, somewhat absent-mindedly said, I actually know. That night 5 years ago when I divorced Victoria. She called you, wanting to get back together, right? He continued, pulling a self-deprecating smile. I lied to her that night, told her I had found someone new and was divorcing her. The look of relief in her eyes, I still remember it. His voice paused slightly, and then that night, you flew back overseas, right? I remembered. Lucy didn't finish her sentence earlier. So, 5 years ago Lucas indeed came back. With his eyes turning a bright red, Lucas didn't say anything. It was an acknowledgement. Mike went on by himself. That night, you went to her apartment to see her. But ended up seeing me kissing her outside the door. But you sure didn't know, that night she was drunk, clinging to my neck, calling me Lucas. She said, it's a shame, Lucas is getting married, doesn't want her anymore. She said, she thought, maybe there was still hope. I saw Lucas stiffen abruptly. Time almost seemed to freeze for about a minute. Then I witnessed a great sorrow appearing on his face. Suddenly, tears streamed down his face, a sight I had never seen before. From the first drop of tear, it seemed like he had lost control, tears kept falling. He sat there stiffly, as if at that moment, all hope was lost. After a while, I heard a sound coming from his throat, a desperate animal-like sob. Mike got up and left the room, dragging his body behind him. That night, Lucas sat by the coffee table for a long time. It wasn't until dawn that he seemed to have made up his mind in a confused state. He stood up decisively, without any hesitation, leaned on the sofa and the wall, and left the room. His phone rang. But he might not have heard it, as he didn't answer it at all. The ringtone sounded multiple times. With a numb look, he walked into the elevator and left the place. I heard him muttering repeatedly to himself, Victoria, Cindy is just my secretary, not my girlfriend. I know you always disliked her before, minded her pursuing me. I just wanted you to care, I just. These 7 years, I never looked for anyone else. But what to do? You can't hear it, you can't hear anything now. I blinked, turned my gaze away, not wanting to see him anymore. As I walked out, the street outside was bustling with traffic. I watched Lucas walk straight toward the street, his steps never stopping. In a low and baffled voice, almost fading in the wind, but I still heard it. He said, Victoria, I can't just leave it like this, can I? I can't. Can I not even say sorry to you? I didn't know what he meant, maybe his mind was really not clear. I'm already dead, what more can he do? Until he crossed the street, his steps still unbroken, headed straight into the traffic lane. Only then did I realize what was happening, and a bad premonition arose in me. He kept muttering to himself, we promised, even with grey hair, we would still walk hand in hand for a lifetime. Victoria, you won't come back, so I'll go find you. At the intersection, a sharp sound of brakes echoed. But with the traffic too dense, it was like a tidal wave of cars. It was too late to brake, and then I heard a loud crash. It was the sound of a body hitting the car, a chilling sound. Just like the day of my accident, the dull, despairing, deathly sound. Epilogue. I let out a sharp scream, but no one could see me, no one could hear my voice. Blood everywhere, everything around me plunged into chaos. Screams, cries, and the sound of ambulance sirens filled the air. My soul lost consciousness, and when I woke up, it was already half a year later. My soul was extremely weak. This was probably the last time I would see things in this world. After Lucas' accident, he was rescued for a day and a night, but never woke up. Lucy sat by his bedside, her expression hollow and lifeless. In just half a year, she had turned all white, looking like she had aged decades. The doctor made the final conclusion that Lucas would never wake up. Maybe he would die tomorrow. Maybe he would just lie there forever. Keeping a breath, becoming a lifelong vegetable. Before that accident, Lucas had already taken care of some things. He asked our relatives to give my father some money. He also contacted the best experts from abroad to treat my sister's illness. On the day my soul woke up after half a year, almost like a spiritual connection, my sister miraculously woke up too. She was accompanied by my father, and they stayed in the hospital to recuperate. I stayed by their side and took one last good look at them. It was a beautiful sunny day. My father unlocked my metaphorical shackles, and spent time with my sister basking in the sun on the hospital lawn. I overheard them talking about me. They mentioned how mischievous I was as a child, once getting into a fight and scratching a boy's face, making him cry. Who was that little boy again? It seemed to be Lucas, but Lucas never argued with me, probably Mike. I tried to remember, but couldn't. But as they talked about me, it felt like we were a family of 3 sitting together. After many years, I finally saw my father and sister smile. I quietly moved closer, hugged my father, then hugged my sister. And with that, this life, for now, was goodbye. Mike turned himself in at the police station. Bribery, colluding with doctors, and his shady business dealings from these years were all exposed by himself. The court trial was imminent, 10 years, or maybe 20. He looked numb as he was driven away by the police. Finally, I went to the hospital and looked at Lucas one last time. He lay quietly on the hospital bed, connected to a breathing apparatus. I was dead, but there was still one living soul for now. And he was like this, probably even his soul was asleep. I couldn't help but move closer, looking at him. It seemed like he could feel it. A tear fell from the corner of his eye. Luckily, Lucy was asleep leaning on the bedside, no one noticed. I was shocked, then breathed a sigh of relief. In that moment, I also felt a bit sad. As New Year's Eve approached, the city had its first snowfall. I saw white snowflakes falling on the windowsill outside the ward. I was reminded of many years ago, the day I first met Lucas. Under the snow-covered bridge, I handed him breakfast, which he initially rejected. Carefully, I said, "I just bought this, haven't eaten it, don't think it's dirty." He hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted it. Later, because of that breakfast, he stood in front of me countless times. 10 years together, half a year in prison. He had loved me deeply, disregarding everything. In the end, he was defeated by a lie. I remembered many snowy days afterwards. Lucas would gently hold my hands in his palms. At that time, the young man's features were as beautiful as the snowy ground, filled with love and longing. He said, "I hope that when our hair turns white with age, we can still be together, hand in hand, for the rest of our lives." But that captivating face could never be matched with the man in the hospital bed today. I closed my eyes, and finally, the awareness of my soul also faded away. That young man who loved and protected me, now only lived on in my memories.